Welcome back. We're going to continue with this theme that we've been following, absolutism versus constitutionalism. Again, it's really a terrible title. The better way to think about this is determining where the power lies in England and France. We spent a fair amount of time in France in our last lecture. We talked about Cardinal Richelieu, raison d'etat, putting state interest above religious interest. We talked about Henry IV, the Edict of Nantes, allowing toleration for French Protestants, the Huguenots. We talked about Cardinal Mazarin, who tutors Louis XIV until he emerges as the Sun King and the absolute ruler of France. In this lecture, we're going to shift across the channel and talk more about England and England's path toward constitutionalism, or a type of government in which the power is dispersed, spread, instead of being contained in the hands of one man. It's a hard journey for the English, but they will get there. So significances, I just mentioned where does the power lie. Ultimately, that question is settled. It lies with Parliament, not the king. And then, of course, the second significance, the old religious controversies are put to rest, finally. This episode in English history has a number of names: the English Civil War, the Puritan Revolution, and then it sort of climaxes with the glorious Revolution of 1688. So we're going to talk about all these things. Let's start with the Puritan Revolution. A little background. This is the first half of the 17th century. The Bourbon monarchies consolidated its power in France. In England, the Tudor monarchy has come to an end with Elizabeth's death. And now the Stuart monarchy of the 17th century begins. And it starts with King James I and then his son, Charles I. As we track the Stuarts, we'll see that they lose control of their kingdom, whereby, or in contrast to France, where the Bourbon kings are consolidating control. In England, the nobility, the gentry, the merchants, whose spokesmen sat in Parliament, the English population is more homogeneous, perhaps, than in France. The upper class of English society is better able to cooperate, to work together in politics, or in opposition to the king. Now, in England, the Puritans, the sort of Calvinist offshoot of the Protestant Reformation, forms a dissident movement within the state church. These Puritans agitate against the ceremonial aspects of Catholicism. The basic differences between Protestantism and Catholicism, of course, lie in the centrality of Scripture for the Protestants. In the Catholic faith, you have the intermediaries of the Pope and the cardinals and the bishops and the priest to interpret Scripture for you. In Protestantism, it's a one-on-one relationship between the parishioner and God. That's a fundamental difference. There are others. Puritans could be found all over England. They were evident in the cities, and they were especially prominent in intellectual circles in England. So let's start with the Stuarts and see what happens with the Stuart monarchy, with James and with Charles and the Puritans. Here's a quote from Donne's excellent book, The Age of Religious Wars. Quote, James I, our first Stuart king, who follows Elizabeth, James I did not look like God's lieutenant. His tongue was too big for his mouth, and his rolling eyes gave him a perpetually apprehensive expression. He wore his clothes heavily padded against the stilettos of would-be assassins, and while stag hunting, he sometimes was tied to his horse to keep him from falling off. Even sycophantic courtiers disliked these hunting parties, during which the king might exultantly slash a fallen stag's belly, shove his hands into the entrails, and then slop his dogs and attendants with blood. A not terribly appealing portrait of King James I. There's an ongoing conflict between James and this Puritan dissident sect within his kingdom. During one conference, King James cries out, "No bishop, no king." The Puritans are demanding less ceremony, less hierarchy within the church, a simpler church, sort of a reversion to what we might call imitatio Christi. The church has sort of lost its mission in the Puritan eyes and should revert to an imitation of Christ, Christ-like behavior. This exclamation, or this utterance, "No bishop, no king," James is saying, look, the English church has its bishops just as the English kingdom has its king, and we're not getting rid of either one of them. What does James say here? Quote, "I will make them," the Puritans, "conform themselves, or I will harry them out of this land, or else do worse." James is sick of the Puritans, and he'd like to see them leave England and leave him be. And of course, many of them do. For those of you who know your U.S. history, these Puritans, many of them will venture across the Atlantic, famously on the Mayflower. And they'll found the Plymouth colony in Massachusetts. 1620, something like that. Charles I is the second Stuart king. He's the son of James. Sort of tone deaf, totally insensitive to public opinion, incapable of the give and take that we think of as being required in politics. Charles, is he religiously committed one way or the other? It's not clear. This fear of Catholicism in England is exacerbated by Charles's courting of Catholic brides. Parliament wants a war with Spain, and Charles wants a Spanish princess to be his bride. So you can see there's a potential for trouble here. Charles I takes liberties with the collection of money. Traditionally, Parliament supplies money, but Charles can go around them at times. He acts unilaterally, in other words, and this angers Parliament. Political issues between Charles I and the Parliament inflames the religious issues in the kingdom. There's sort of a permanent animosity and distrust between Charles I and Parliament. Again, in 1628, Charles needs money, but he finds that Parliament is against him. Both the House of Lords and the House of Commons cooperated closely in framing a famous petition of right. They essentially grant the king taxes, revenue, and they extract his promise not to go behind Parliament's back to collect taxes in the future, and not to imprison men without due process of law. Charles agrees to these conditions. Of course, this agreement is an admission that he has indeed done these things that Parliament's accusing him of. Charles's personal rule between 1629 and 1640 has often been compared with Richelieu's contemporaneous administration in France, but the results are quite different. Charles never comes close to creating a kingdom where he can exert his will in England the way Richelieu did in France. He didn't have ministers to enforce his decisions as Richelieu did. He had no intendants, no standing army to back him up. Local administration in England depended on the corporation of unpaid justices of the peace, many of whom had sat in Parliament, many of whom were critical of royal policy. The French tax burden fell mainly on the unprivileged peasantry, but the Stuarts' tax burdens provoked the English nobility, the gentry, and the merchants. So the French king is extracting revenue from the peasantry, while the English king, Charles I, is attempting to extract revenue from the upper classes. And these upper classes are increasingly sort of feeling their political and economic importance, and an increasing willingness to contest issues with the king. So let's go to the religious factor that's key here. This is the most explosive single issue. Charles I picked Archbishop Laud to lead the Anglican Church. A very industrious man, very authoritative man seeking religious uniformity in the kingdom. Across the Channel, of course, Richelieu had respected the religious liberty of the Huguenots. Archbishop Laud deliberately challenged the Puritans. So you can see we're moving in divergent paths here. Now, big trouble came when Charles and Laud attempted to coerce Scotland to impose upon Scotland the Anglican prayer book on this Presbyterian population. The Scots rejected this imposition. In 1638, the Scots swore a national covenant to defend to the death their religious and political liberties. Charles tried to suppress this Scottish rebellion, but he couldn't raise an effective army. By 1640, the Scots had actually invaded the north of England. King Charles I is now completely cornered. With no money, no army, and no popular support, he had to summon Parliament again, finally in 1640. We're going to take a break there, and we'll come back and fight the English Civil War.